So I get a lot of questions on the Spector Creative channel about the toy making process, and specifically sculpts for toys. And, well, specifically with that, why once you have a sculpt for a toy, why you can't then just use this sculpt to make this toy in lots of different ways. What I mean by this, as an example, so here's Jackson, right? The rabbit from Star Wars. Never done as a 3 3/4 figure, only done in the 6-inch Black Series. For a lot of us, myself included, we're 3 3/4 fans, and it always felt kind of like a kick in the face that here's a character that you may have always wanted, but we're not going to give it to you in the scale that you've been collecting for 30 years. We're going to do it in a brand new scale. And fans are saying, well, okay, well, can't you just take this figure now, make a 3 3/4 one? You've got the sculpt. Well, it doesn't quite work that way, and let me explain why. Sculpt and scale of figures are actually not related. And a great way, as an example of that, is looking at the DC Universe Classics line that I worked on at Mattel. These were sculpts done by the Four Horsemen, and they were done as 2-ups, meaning 6-inch action figures, but sculpted as 12-inch sculpts, or maquettes, if you will. They're not articulated, they just look like they're articulated. You can tell because you can't see the pin joints. Although, I guess if you took a modern Hasbro Marvel Legends, you wouldn't see pin joints either, but that's not important right now. So yes, for the most part, almost all of the DC Universe Classic toys that the Four Horsemen sculpted were done at 2-to-1. You can see that here with Black Hand. You can see the sculpt on the left and the action figure that came out of this sculpt on the right. And the question is, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. How can you take a 12-inch figure and turn it into a 6-inch figure? This is something Mattel was doing long before DC Universe Classic, and not all figures are sculpted at a 2-to-1. In fact, most of the Masters of the Universe figures the Horsemen did were sculpted 1-to-1, the same size. It's basically an artistic choice. When you sculpt at a larger scale, you can sometimes cover details better, but when you sculpt at a 1-to-1 scale, like a 6-inch figure sculpting at its 6-inch, sometimes the sculpt can become tighter that way. It really is just a personal choice of the artist, of the sculptor, or the marketing team, of how they want it designed. And one of the advantages, obviously, of, 6-inch figures is they're smaller, and it becomes very difficult to display prototype 2-ups when they're 12 inches because they take up so much more space in the display case. And this was always an issue I had trying to show off new product at conventions, was if I only had the 12-inch prototypes. Eventually, for DC Universe Classic, when it became the Signature Series, we switched over to 1-to-1. So you can see Huntress here is just sculpted 6 inches, not 12 inches, and not shrunk down. And again, a big part of this was because we needed more display space to show off prototypes at conventions, and showing off these 12-inch figures took up too much space. All right, so speaking of space, see how we translated to the Space Rabbit. Why is it we can't just take this sculpt and turn it into a 3 3/4? Well, you can take a sculpt and you can turn it into any scale, whether it's a physical sculpt or a digital sculpt, it doesn't matter, because tooling, which is what produces the toy, is made from a plastic copy of the sculpt, and this can be made in different scales. What you are spending money on is the tooling, the giant metal case that will probably cost about $100,000 for a fully articulated figure, and out of that metal mold case, you're going to get a sprue with different plastic pieces that then need to be removed and assembled. It's that tool that is the huge capital investment. So you can take a sculpt and you can do a plastic rendition and make a tool out of that, or a copy to then make the tool, and you can do that at different scales. So let me sort of show you how that works using a character that's been done at many, many scales. Stormtroopers, specifically Episode 7 Stormtroopers, our favorite Stormtroopers, right? When I was at Jakks Pacific, we had a Big Figs line, and we did Stormtroopers at many different sizes. We had Stormtroopers that were perfectly sized to battle child infants, and we had Stormtroopers that were perfectly sized to battle child kids. It's all about making Stormtroopers that were, fun and huge. That's what Big Figs was all about. Now, regardless of what scale, we had 12-inch Stormtroopers, we had 31-inch Stormtroopers, and we even had a ridiculously large 48-inch Stormtrooper that was set up as I guess it was a room guard, was the play pattern, but technically an action figure. I think some parents bought this, chopped it up, and used it as a costume for their kids. It was pretty amazing. I mean, heck, this was a very weird, wonky scale, because finding retail placement for something this big is not exactly easy. They usually wind up falling off where they're supposed to be and just sort of hanging out in the aisle. So you can see why this line didn't hang around that long. It's mostly difficulty in retail placement. But the point being is all of these figures, all these stormtroopers, all came from the same sculpt. Every single one. The sculpt was only done once. In fact, it was a digital sculpt that was provided by Lucasfilm. The same sculpt was given to all licensees. Hasbro, Mattel, Jakks, anybody making toys for Episode 7 was given the same sculpt. In fact, one of the reasons that we know this is because if you look at any Stormtrooper that was released for Episode 7, The Force Awakens, for movie time, not like a Episode 7 Stormtrooper made years later, but one that was actually released at the time of film, they all have backwards ankles because the sculpt was wrong. The sculpt was backwards. So you can tell they were all made from the same digital sculpt because they have the same error, whether it's a high-end toy like a Hot Toys or a Sideshow figure, or your low-end basic figure from Hasbro. Every Stormtrooper from Episode 7 has the same backwards ankle, or reverse ankle on its back, by its Achilles heel. Achilles heel. You know what I'm talking about. So yeah, you can absolutely make multiple tools out of the same sculpt, but every single time you do, you have to pay for that tool. So it's $100,000 for a 12-inch, then for a 31-inch and a 48-inch. You have to retool it. So that sculpt becomes very, usable, and you can use that sculpt to generate different tools and different scales. But every time you want to do a different scale, you have to retool using that same original sculpt, whether it's a hand sculpt or a digital sculpt. You don't save anything in that sense. The sculpt is a low investment. The tool is really your high investment. So you can make figures bigger than the sculpt. You can make figures smaller than the sculpt. It's all about how much money you want to spend on tooling. And you can use that sculpt to generate lots of tooling and lots of scales. You're just going to spend a lot of money. I hope this video helped explain the difference between tooling and sculpts and how sculpts can be used to generate different scales of the same figure. So yeah, that Jackson figure, he'd have to get retooled, but they could use the sculpt to tool another Jackson at 3 3/4. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.